Well, hello everyone. This is Luke Quinn here making my presentation, and this is a presentation on the research I've been working on for my paper, and the paper is on iconoclasm and the Scottish Reformation. I'll just briefly go over with you the outline for this. So first of all, I'll go over some definitions. What is the Scottish Reformation? What is iconoclasm? Second, we'll talk about the historical context for the Scottish Reformation. Third, we'll talk about influences on Scottish worship. Why was Scottish worship the way it was, and where did it get its influences from? Next, we'll talk about the reasoning behind the Scottish iconoclasm. Once we define iconoclasm, we'll have to discuss why it occurred in the Scottish Reformation. As an example of this, we'll talk about Scottish church buildings for just a moment and about how that affected their worship and their approach to worship, how that was different from the previously Roman Catholic worship, which utilized icons. And we'll talk about some of the cultural and social results of Scottish iconoclasm, what it did to the Scottish culture and how that affected other peoples. We'll also talk about the effects of the Scottish Reformation and its iconoclasm on the Restoration movement, which will be an interesting connection to make for those of us in the Churches of Christ or other Restoration churches. And then last, I'll close with a little bit about the Westminster Confession, mentions this issue, and about some of the ways it's been interpreted in the past and now in current Scottish and Presbyterian practices. So let's begin. First of all, what is the Scottish Reformation? This definition is pretty simple. It's the process whereby Scotland broke away from the Catholic Church and established the Protestant Church of Scotland. It forms part of the wider European 16th century Protestant Reformation. So that's a very simple understanding or definition of it. Of course, the reality is much more complex in the Church of Scotland's interactions with England and with other churches. One thing I found so far in my research is how international a movement the Reformation was, which seems like it should go without saying. But since you see different churches that become regionally associated, like the German Lutheran Church, the Calvinistic churches in Geneva, the Scottish Presbyterian churches, and then the Church of England, it does seem, when you look at it that way, as if many of the Reformation churches became nationalistic churches. And it does seem that to some degree that is true. And yet, they definitely interacted with each other and influenced each other. And the cause of reform was an international cause. And that will become important when we discuss the second aspect of this topic, which is iconoclasm. A definition of iconoclasm is the rejection or destruction of religious images as heretical. This stems from the second commandment in the Old Testament, which is that you shall make no graven image. And it is something repeated and spoken of in the New Testament, and is something that has been a particularly ferocious debate throughout the history of the church, both in the East and in the West, both in the Catholic and in Protestant churches, even down to the present day. So let's talk about some of the historical context of the Scottish Reformation. Of course, the first important character here is John Knox, born 1514, died 1572. Knox is perhaps as influential in the Scottish Reformation as Luther was in the German. I have a book that I'll rely on to some degree here. It's a very interesting book by Arthur Herman called How the Scots Invented the Modern World. His first chapter in that book is called The New Jerusalem. And in speaking of the Scottish Reformation, this is what he says. Just as the German Reformation was largely the work of a single individual, Martin Luther, so the Scottish Reformation was the achievement of one man of heroic will and tireless energy, John Knox. So a lot of the credit, you could say, or a lot of the issues in the Scottish Reformation and for the Reformation itself, and specifically as it concerns iconoclasm, goes to this man. Knox was a very influential character in the Scottish Reformation. And what he wanted was a clean break from Catholicism. This is something that shows up quite clearly throughout the history of the Scottish Church. This is something that is mentioned in another book that I'll mention, which is the Oxford History of Christian Worship. Very great, very large book, but they have a good article in here on the Reformed tradition in Scotland. And one thing they say about the church in Scotland is that they wanted a clean sweep, radical break with the past, and a new beginning. These were the intention, the worship, were the intention. And the worship of the medieval church was denounced in its entirety as idolatry. So there was definitely a sense in which the Scottish church was trying to put Roman Catholic history behind itself. Going back to Arthur Herman's work, this is what he says regarding John Knox and the Scottish church. It says, above all, John Knox wanted to turn the Scots into God's chosen people, Scotland into the New Jerusalem. To do this, Knox was willing to sweep away everything about Scotland's past that linked it to the Catholic Church. As one admirer said, others have snipped at the branches of popery, but he strikes at the roots to destroy the whole. He and his followers scoured away not only Scottish Catholicism, but all its physical manifestations, from monasteries and bishops and clerical vestments to holy relics and market square crosses. They smashed stained glass windows and saints' statues, ripped out choir stalls and rood screens, overturned altars. All these symbols of a centuries-old tradition of religious culture, which we would call great works of art, were for Knox marks of idolatry and the synagogue of Satan, as he called the Roman Catholic Church. In any case, the idols disappeared from southern Scotland, and the Scottish Church rose up to take their place. It's a very powerful rendition. Why iconoclasm happened in the Scottish Reformation? It seemed to be the desire to put Roman Catholicism. There was, however, some continuity. This is something that the Oxford history mentions as well. It said that the same church buildings that used to be Catholic were used for Presbyterian or Scottish congregational worship, although with major modifications in their layout. Many priests and monks conformed to the Reformation and were made readers or ministers. Some of them eagerly and intelligently embraced the new understanding of the faith. Others were time servers and continued quietly with many old practices and customs. Popular feeling in many parts of lowland Scotland was inflamed against Romanism, and it was urban mobs that destroyed many friaries, shrines, and images, and removed altars and the instruments of idolatry. So the interesting thing that I found is that the Highland Scots, especially in a certain small region, retained more of the Catholicism than down in the lowlands. That seemed to be the major divide. In fact, it was really only a few of those Highland Catholic Scots who went with Bonnie Prince Charlie when he tried to take the throne of Scotland back in the Jacobite uprising of 1745 to 1746, which ended tragically in the Battle of Culloden. And I found this to be an interesting inaccuracy in the popular view of that struggle, to what degree that it is popular. It's not mentioned very much in popular culture, but interestingly, for some odd reason, I've become aware of that show called Outlander, which is about a woman who's brought back in time to 18th century Scotland. And during the course of that show, you see the Jacobite uprising in the Battle of Culloden as well. But one of the misunderstandings there and in other places that I've seen is that pretty much all of Scotland wanted this to happen. And in fact, most of the lowland Scots, which represented the majority, were not Catholic, one, by this point, and two, were pretty much for a union with England. In fact, the Scottish union with England was agreed upon voluntarily by the Scots, and it was really only the Catholic Highlanders who never really liked the state of affairs. And so you see a division between the Lowlanders and the Highlanders, and it was in the more populous metropolitan, if you could use the term, lowlands, that the Protestant Reformation really took hold, and iconoclasm was most severe. The Scots were, and this is also not widely known, a very forward-thinking people at this time, from the time of the Reformation onward. In fact, you could see a few links between the Reformation and the later Enlightenment. I think that it began with a clean break from the old world and ended with a very ingenuitive and forward-looking society in Scotland that made it an extremely literate society and in some ways very scientifically advanced. It's really an amazing transition that the Scots were really the poorest nation in Europe and from that time became very, very successful. In fact, this book I mentioned by Arthur Herman is called this, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, the true story of how Western Europe's poorest nation created our world and everything in it. Very auspicious title, and there's a lot of truth in it. But I think that you see a lot of the advances in Scottish literature, medicine is another big one, and just in the Scottish cultural worldview as a whole in the Scottish Reformation. And that was a big part of it. So that's something about the historical context of the Scottish Reformation. Another aspect of this historical context is, of course, the Calvinist church in Geneva. Knox had been to Geneva, I believe, twice, if I remember correctly. He lived there at a certain time and then later went back and was a minister at a church there for a while. And he was deeply impressed by the religious state, essentially, that John Calvin had formed. And he sought to similarly reach. He wanted it to be, as Arthur Herman had suggested, excuse me, a new Jerusalem. That was a very large motivator for him. He wanted to make a pure and holy and religious state. And in that state, you saw a very clear unification between, well, the church and the state, the political and civil and religious authorities. And so these were all very big influences for the Scottish Reformation in the first place. So a lot of the theology involved with John Calvin also affected the way John Knox saw things and the way the Scottish churches saw things as well. So speaking of that, let's go on to some of the influences on Scottish worship, because when we're speaking of iconoclasm, of course, this has mostly to do with the way people worship. Icons were most commonly used in devotion and worship of the Roman Catholics from time out of mind. And so this was a very radical change. And it's interesting to note the different influences that there were that influenced the Scottish Church to make the changes they did. So in Scottish worship, you do see some influence, first of all, from the Lutheran churches. This seemed to be less significant than the other influences, but it has been at least mentioned in some of the literature that I have seen. Some of the hymns and some of the theology, but mostly there was a lot of trading, I think, and translating of Lutheran hymns. And that was something that has affected to some degree Scottish worship. So there's a little bit of Lutheran influence. There's also some English influence. Even though there were conflicts between the Scottish and English churches, there was also a good deal of cooperation over the years. In fact, John Knox himself apparently was a minister for churches in England and worked with them to a great degree. And Knox had quite a lot of influence in English politics. And so you see some back and forth between the Scottish and English churches. John Knox approved of the Book of Common Prayer when it was written, and although it never really gained full sway in Scotland, it was definitely published there and people knew what it was. So there was some influence from the English sources. But by far, the biggest influence that we see on Scottish worship is, once again, from the Calvinist churches. So from the influence of Calvin, John Knox wrote two books that have been very foundational to the Scottish movement. One is the Scots Confession, and the other, of course, is the Book of Discipline. Both of these books really called for a lot of things. Of course, it laid out Scottish, Reformation theology pretty clearly, but it also called for the punishment of idolaters. And of course, by idolaters, what Knox meant were Catholics, people who venerated saints, statues, and icons. And so this was associated with idolatry, and it was to be stamped out of Scottish churches and the Scottish land, as it was in Geneva. Now, let's go into some of the reasoning here. We've talked about Scottish iconoclasm and what it is, but why exactly? Well, behind the Scottish Reformation were a few principles. In the first place, what the Scottish churches wanted to do was return to purity, integrity, and simplicity. They were looking to restore the original intention of Christ for his church as it concerns doctrine, practice, and worship. So there's this sense of purity in which you don't put in anything that Christ never commanded or envisioned and that is not authorized in the scriptures. There's also a sense of integrity, which is that the worship that they performed was to be only that which Christ had commanded, that it was to actually be that which was pleasing to the Lord. And there's the principle of simplicity. The view of the Scottish Church was that all of the icons and images and all of the saints' days and feast days that had accumulated over the years in Roman Catholicism effectively dragged it down by sheer weight of force back into paganism. And so simplicity was called for, to go back to in some sense, to the simple, relatively easily understood commandments of Christ. And it's interesting when you look at some of these principles, the connection you already see, perhaps, between the Presbyterian Scottish Reformed theology and the goals and principles of the later Restoration churches. You can already see some of that connection there. We'll get more into that later. The second thing behind Scottish iconoclasm is that based on this idea of purity, integrity, and simplicity, there's the idea that the Bible alone should be the normative standard for authentic Christian worship, that is the only thing that we should use in our worship. And that would be the standard for it. So we don't add anything new that wasn't put in the Bible already. And so the result of this was the sweeping away of stained glass, of relics, pilgrimages, veneration of saints, holy days, except for Sundays and Easter. Apparently, those are still celebrated, and as well as images, statues, and icons. So that's the reasoning behind the Scottish iconoclasm. The first book of discipline in 1560 by John Knox, idolatry was to be utterly suppressed in all bounds and places of this realm. Again, idolatry is defined as the veneration of icons and images and saints. This was to be utterly suppressed in all bounds and places of this realm, meaning the realm of Scotland. This included what he said, the Mass, that is the Roman Catholic Mass, invocation of saints, that's the adoration of them and the veneration of saints and the prayers to and for them. Adoration of images and the keeping and retaining of the same. So it's not just praying to an image or praying through an image or adoring or venerating an image. It was actually having an image, retaining it. You have some cases where you have an old image, let's say a cross in the town square, and when the Reformation comes through, maybe since the cross has been there for so long, even though you don't venerate or pray at its feet anymore, you might still keep it there for, let's say, the purpose and sake of tradition and history. Well, Knox would say, no, you don't retain or keep those images because those are idolatrous, and you need to get rid of them. So that was the mentality. So that's the reasoning. And a good example of this is how Scottish church buildings and worship affected each other and how Scottish church buildings look. The one thing I wanted to read was another section from Oxford history, because I like how they describe some of the Scottish churches. It says, from the time of the Reformation, churches have been regarded in Scotland not as shrines, but rather as meeting places for God's people when they come to worship God together. During the Reformation, most of the monastic chapels and chantries, and even the cathedral in a city like St. Andrews, were destroyed or left to decay, stripped of their furnishings and ornaments. It was quite different with parish churches and college chapels, which had to be adapted for the use of a reformed congregation. Big city churches, after they had had altars and all the instruments of the old forms of worship removed, were often divided into two, three, or even four churches for different congregations, often with galleries and a high pulpit, so that everyone could hear the preacher. And that's one aspect of the Reformed and Scottish practices when it came to their church buildings. The way that they structured them were very different. And as this mentioned, the way that they viewed them was very different from before. Churches to them are not shrines. They're not holy, sacred places akin to the Old Testament temple where God makes his presence known. And if you want to feel his presence, or you want to be there to worship him, it's not that you have to go to that place to receive those blessings. No, the building was merely a convenience. It was a place built by the church, and it was only special and sacred because the church had built it. And it was only special and sacred when the church was using it. And so this was a very important aspect of their theology. Another aspect of it, of course, is the emphasis on preaching. There was a de-emphasis on the Eucharist, as the Catholics used to call it, on the communion, or the sacrament of communion, or the Lord's Supper. There was a much heavier emphasis in the Reformation churches on preaching. Now, this was something that was very true in the Calvinist churches in Geneva. John Calvin, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the first, at least, to move the pulpit over from one side of the sanctuary to the middle, and to place the altar down at the front. And there are some different versions of this in the Presbyterian and Scottish churches, but largely they followed suit. And along with that came a much heavier emphasis on the preaching of the word. The idea was that you needed the word and the sacraments, and you needed them to be at least balanced. And I think what you ended up seeing was a heavier and heavier emphasis on preaching. And again, there's an interesting connection here with the Restoration churches, because I think that became even more pronounced in our movement as well. This church that I'm showing you right now is actually a church in my town, although it's a much older picture of it. This is the first Presbyterian church here in Greenwood, Mississippi. It was built, I'm not exactly sure when it was built, but it was built in the, I believe, 1800s. And it's a beautiful building. It's been around for a long time. There was an emphasis on the Gothic architecture in Scotland early on, especially with the sort of Anglo-Scottish influence. But from time out of mind, the Scottish churches have more heavily emphasized the Romanesque type of style here, which is mostly what you see in this type of building. And it's also much simpler, especially when you look on the inside. This is the inside of that building. This building has an enormous organ, beautiful organ, sounds lovely, all along the back of the wall here. And if you notice, although in this case they have a crucifix at the back of this sanctuary, you'll see that's not a part of the furnishings. That's something they added in later. You do still see the pulpit off to the left, and the altar in the front. I don't know if that's always been the way that it was in this church. I assume so, because the pulpit is very old. But one thing you'll notice is how bare it is compared to maybe some of the higher church traditions. No stained glass, no icons, no images. The vestments even that these ministers wear is very simple. They're mostly academic robes. So this is what you see even to this day. Scottish church buildings are focused on contemplation and doctrine, teaching, preaching. That at least is its history. So images and icons never really had much of a place in these types of churches, for reasons we've already discussed. Let's talk about some of the results of iconoclasm. It's one thing that is really fascinating to me when I am studying this is what, I mean, you can see unintended consequences, or maybe things that relate or co-occur that may not necessarily be related. But I can't help but wonder if a lot of the emphasis, or let's say the de-emphasis on icons, also led to an increased emphasis on the word, meaning being able to read, being able to understand for oneself. These were very important to John Calvin in his Book of Discipline and in other literature. Excuse me, John Knox, in his Book of Discipline and other literature, and to the Scottish churches as a whole. Scotland, of course, had what you might call an inferiority complex compared to England. because it was so poor and so illiterate. And so they really changed a lot in trying to make sure as many people as possible could read. And this was something that the religious authorities were heavily invested in. And so they advocated, and John Knox advocated, for state schools. And they developed a system of public schools paid for by local churches, more or less, uh, throughout the throughout the country. And so Scotland actually became a very literate culture pretty early on compared to most other Western nations. It became what you could call a word-based society. And I think that there's a significant connection there with their iconoclasm. And there's a, excuse me, there's some work by an intellectual, a Jewish intellectual, as it happens, of the last century named Neil Postman, and he did a lot of writing on the different types of media that we use and how they affect the way that we view the world. And he very much emphasized print media. And of course, he was writing during the 70s, 80s, and was very worried about the influx of television, which and was kind of hopeful about the new burgeoning technology and medium of the internet and of using computers. And I think he'd be disappointed in how we eventually started to use them more or less like television. But basically, what he was saying was the interesting thing about the Jews in ancient Israel is that they were a much more literate society than the average Near Eastern ancient culture, precisely because of the second commandment. And precisely because when you don't have images, and that's not a form of art that's really even open to you, what you become is a very word-based society, and that has a lot of very practical effects, of practical benefits too for a society. And so that's an interesting result of iconoclasm that you do see in Scotland as well. And again, I could be wrong in the relation between those two things, but it seems, pretty likely in my estimation. But along with that, of course, comes this emphasis on personal knowledge. The thing about the Scottish Church and Reformation churches in general was that over against the closed book mentality of Catholic theology, in other words, that the Bible was something that many people weren't even allowed to read in their own languages, at least, there was a lot more sense of mystique and authority surrounding the scriptures in the Catholic Church at the time. And so, over against that, many of the Reformation churches, including John Knox and the Scottish Church, became they began to heavily emphasize personal knowledge of the Bible. And one of the main reasons they wanted to institute state schools and teach ordinary children how to read was so that they could read the Bible for themselves. And so this is a very radical movement, and it produced quite a lot of good, you could say. I think that you see Scotland being a very literate society compared to other cultures at the time, which was a great surprise, not only to other Europeans, but even to the Scots themselves. In fact, I have a quote from David Hume from 1757 that has something to say about that. He said, "Is it not strange that at a time when we have lost our princes, our parliaments, our independent governments, even the presence of our chief nobility, are unhappy in our accent and pronunciation, speak a very corrupt dialect of the tongue which we make use of? Is it not strange, I say, that in these circumstances we should really be the people most distinguished for literature in Europe?" Yes, well, that is quite incredible. Even the Scots themselves couldn't believe it. But it may have some thing to do with their mentality towards representational media and their emphasis on word. So that's, I think, a very interesting uh, discussion on the results of iconoclasm. So now, briefly, as I close, let's talk about how all this affected the Restoration movement. The thing about the Campbells, and I have a picture here of Alexander Campbell, one of the leaders in the early Restoration movement, and his father, Thomas Campbell, is that these men are from Northern Ireland. They're Scotch-Irish people. They were members of the Presbyterian Church. So all the stuff that we've been talking about here, this is the world that they were born into. And so you can see how this affected their views. There are a lot of similarities between the Restoration mentality and the Presbyterian Scottish Church. First of all, of course, there's the emphasis on the Bible. There's also an emphasis on the purity, integrity, and simplicity of our practice, doctrine, and worship. And along with that has come traditionally a disdain of icons as idolatrous, and that is something that's very common even to this day. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that the Campbells and the other Restorationist church members blindly swallowed the Presbyterian line. That's not true at all. I mean, Thomas Campbell was a Presbyterian pastor, but he was effectively pushed out and quit kind of at the same time because of some disagreements he had with the Westminster Confession. He didn't agree with everything in there. Largely, a lot of the Calvinist theology, mainly think of the 5 points and things like that, are things that the Campbells really disagreed with. And to this day, we have a very clear distinction between us and the Restorationist churches and the Reformed tradition. So it's not like we just copied them, but you can see some influence. And I think that you can see that since that's the world in which the Campbells were born, the way that the discussions were framed for them were framed originally by this history we've been discussing today. Now, we're talking about the Scottish Church as if it's one thing, and it's not. If you've noticed, I've interchangeably used the Scottish Church and the Presbyterian Church, and it is true that the Presbyterians all have their basis or their origin in Scotland and in the original Scottish Church or Kirk, they say. But the fact is, there are several Presbyterian Scottish churches, and they don't all agree on many issues, especially when it comes to um, icons, crucifixes, and religious symbols. And they don't all agree when it comes to the Westminster Confession and its teaching on the subject. But speaking of the Westminster Confession, this is one of the most influential documents in that church, and so this is what they say when it comes to the second commandment and to the making of images. It says the sins forbidden in the second commandment are all devising, counseling, commanding, using, and anywise approving any religious worship not instated by God himself, tolerating a false religion, the making any representation of God, of all or of any of the three persons, be the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, either inwardly in our mind or outwardly in any kind of image or likeness of any creature whatsoever, or worshipping of it, or God in it, or by it, the making of any representation of feigned deities, and all worship of them, or service belonging to them, all superstitious devices corrupting the worship of God, adding to it or taking from it, whether invented and taken up of ourselves, or received by tradition from others, though under the title of antiquity, custom, devotion, good intent, or any other pretense whatsoever, simony, sacrilege, all neglect, contempt, hindering, and opposing the worship and ordinances which God hath appointed. It was very thorough, actually, because it covers any type of use of images. Because some people will defend against iconoclasm by saying, well, we're not really worshiping the icons. We're not praying to it. We worship God in it or by it. And so they're saying, well, you can't even do that. And also it's like whatever reason you did it for, whether it's just, because of custom or because of antiquity, good intent or bad intent, because you're wanting to commit sacrilege or because you're wanting to commit simony. Either way, it's wrong. And that was the major stance for the Scottish Church for a long time, but not everyone sees it that way now. As you saw in that image I showed you here, there's at least some exception made today, and it depends on the church, of course. So the history of iconoclasm in the Scottish Reformation is much more complex than what I have described here, but I thought I could go over some of the basic findings in my research so far. So I'm looking forward to finishing this paper and maybe putting some of these ideas a little more organized format. It's been helpful for me, and I hope it's been helpful for you. So thank you very much. Give me a minute, because take me a minute to figure out how to stop recording. Here it is. Thank you very much.